Chris Hollins, welcome to Hello
Doug.
Houston. Good to have you here now. I think there's something about the budget of the city of Houston, a lot of things that people don't understand, but it's and correct me if I get the numbers wrong here, but it's a $7 billion budget, right?
That it is.
Right? But about 40% of it is dedicated to enterprise funds, right? We're talking about aviation, so on, that you can't touch, right?
Closer to 60%.
60%
It's really
now.
40% on the general fund side.
Okay, it's the general fund now. It's 40, but thanks for correcting me on that. And most of the general fund, which you can spend, basically, it's police and fire, right?
Absolutely. So 60%. So the general fund is $3 billion. 60% of that is dedicated to simply police and fire. That's public safety, 101. Another one out of every $6 is spent on debt service. That's paying the bill for infrastructure projects that we've incurred in the past. And so you're left with a quarter of that budget that's spent on everything else that you rely on the city for. That's getting your trash picked up. That's our parks and green spaces. It's fixing our roads and sidewalks. And so those dollars get tight pretty quickly.
Right. And the city has managed to balance the books, so to speak, in a way, through some one-time measures over the past few years. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, when you're thinking about how you're going to pay the bills, right, and cover all these critical services, a big chunk of how that gets paid for is your property taxes and your sales taxes. But for several years, that hasn't quite balanced the books. And so we've looked to other ways to do that. Sometimes it's selling a piece of property, right? In the wake of Hurricane Harvey or in the wake of the pandemic, we've had federal funding that came in and closed some of those gaps for us. But as of right now, a lot of that isn't available. And so we're stuck with deficit spending. And that's what we've been doing now for the current year that we're in. We have the highest deficit in the city's history of upwards of $200 million.
I know we want to get deeper into all of that, but there's a story that we've been reporting on at News 88.7. Dominic Anthony Walsh has been reporting on it. It was a lawsuit filed in 2019 by two Houston-based engineers, made the case that the city was shortchanging a voter-mandated fund for streets and damage projects. And the city faced a legal defeat in January, which you've described as a real gut punch to the city financially, because it would require allocating nearly $200 million more than planned over 2025 and 26 fiscal years. Can you take us through a little bit about what this lawsuit is and what it means to the city, and where we haven't followed court orders, or where we have and where we should have seen it differently?
Absolutely. So back in 2018, Houston voters said to the city, we want you to take a very specific amount of the money that we pay in property taxes and use it just for roads and drainage projects, nothing else. And the city said, okay. However, the city has something that's called a revenue cap, where we can't bring in over a certain amount of money. And in years after 2018, the city began to lower the tax rate and said, hey, since we're lowering the tax rate, we'll put a little bit less into roads and drainage too. Now, this lawsuit said, hey, you can't do that. The voters didn't say, if you do this, you can do that. The voters said, put this amount of money, no questions asked. And those plaintiffs who sued the city won that case. We appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately denied the city's arguments and said, hey, effective immediately, you got to put in that full rate, no questions asked. And so, where we are is the city is attempting to reach a settlement with those plaintiffs that would give us a grace period of 3 years to get into compliance. But as of this moment, the court hasn't approved that. And so we're in this dicey space where we're hoping the court allows us this grace period. But if they say no, then as you just mentioned, we're on the hook for about $200 million.
So I guess my first question in all of that is, how come we didn't do what originally the voters said to do? Just because the cap came down, we still had made a guarantee, the city as we, had made a guarantee to pay this money. Where was the idea that you could just not do it at the level you were supposed to?
Yeah, I can't speak for previous administrations, but I know that the legal argument was that what was in the voter, the charter amendment was, 11.8 cents or its equivalent. And the city took that its equivalent term to mean that if we lower our tax rate, then we can proportionally lower that 11.8 cents. Now, the court said, no, that's not the case. And so we have to either get into compliance or, again, we have our fingers crossed right now that the court will grant us this grace period. But that hasn't come to pass yet.
And we know that the budget is a very delicate thing, and there's only so much money there, and there's so much cost and all that. A hit like this to the city budget does what?
It's really significant. Coming out of the pandemic, because of federal funding and support, we had a record fund balance. That's the city's savings account. It got up close to $600 million. Now, this past year that we're wrapping up now, we spent down over $200 million of that in deficit spending. And the budget that we're looking at today has another $100+ million in deficit spending. So you can see that savings account is dwindling. Now, if you were to tack on another $200 million, then we're getting really, really close to where we might not make payroll on Friday. And of course, my job is to make sure that we have money in the bank to continue these critical city services, and that's where I get called in to pump the brakes.
So help us understand then too your position and how you can do this, because your budget comes from City Hall, and our councilman and our mayor put together this budget. Mm-hmm. You have to abide by what they say, correct?
My role in the process is called certification of availability of funds.
Okay.
What that means is we have enough money in the bank to pay for this. It doesn't. So it's not my opinion of if it's a good budget or a bad budget. It's can we pay for it?
But if we can't, what are you allowed to do in your position? Are you allowed to shift to work things to make it work, or does this then have to go back to city council to
It has to
decide?
go back to them. So if I withhold certification, and of course I wouldn't just do that and sit on my hands. I would explain to them the situation. Hey, you have to go find another $25, $50 million, $100 million, and it would be up to them to submit a budget that would pass muster. Again, not my moral judgment or anything like that, but just doing the math and telling the truth about how much money we have.
Can you
and
give
how much
recommendations?
I can do whatever I want, but it's up to them.
Well, it's nice to be you.
But that's just, look, you can make recommendations too, just to be clear.
But I mean, officially, can you submit back when you say you don't certify, but you recommend looking
There's
at
no
these
official
areas
process for that, but ultimately, when we first saw this, right, when the court first gave its ruling and I said this is a gut punch, I recommended a task force that included me, the mayor, members of city council, and staff that was going to work on this problem. The mayor said no thanks, right? But again, I'd be open to making those suggestions, but at the end of the day, it's their budget to propose, amend, and pass.
So on the federal level, we've seen all of the major financial rating services, Moody's and so on, they've downgraded our debt, basically. What impact has all of this at City Hall had on our bond rating, and what are your concerns in regard to that?
Well, the bond rating is certainly in question right now. Last year, after we issued debt to pay for the firefighter settlement, two of our ratings agencies put us on what's called a negative outlook. That's not an immediate downgrade, but what they're telling us is there's a greater than 1 in 3 chance that we will downgrade you going forward because of your practices. And they told us a couple of things. One, you're taking on debt. Number two, you're spending down, with deficit spending. Your budget is not in balance. And then number three, you're not looking at your long-term contributions like your pensions and your other post-employment benefits. And so we want to see y'all take some steps and lay out a plan that's going to balance the budget, that's going to look at these long-term liabilities, and that's also potentially going to pay off this debt. And right now, I haven't seen us make serious corrections on those things.
I want to remind everyone we are talking with the City Controller, Chris Hollins. If you have questions for Chris, give us a call or text us at 713-440-8870.
So we're talking about how much are we paying out now in debt? How much are we putting on the credit card every year is what I'm wondering.
So the debt payment, right now the city has upwards of $15 billion in debt. But the debt payments that come out of the general fund are roughly about $500 million.
Okay.
It's a big amount of money.
And if our bond rating is lowered, what happens?
What happens then is that investors say, you're a more risky bet, and so if you want to borrow from me, we're going to charge you a little bit more. That means an interest rate goes up. That means those debt payments go up, and that means less money to pay for critical services like public safety and trash pickup.
I think a lot of people might be confused about the firefighter settlement and what happened there. Can you walk us through that and tell us how much we now owe as a result of that settlement and how the city proposes to pay that off?
Sure. So we were in a dispute with our firefighters for about 7 years. They were operating without a contract. And what would happen in the private sector is that, the union would strike. Well, of course, we need our firefighters to show up and fight fires. And so by state law, they're not allowed to strike in that situation, but they are allowed to file a lawsuit against the city, which they did. Mayor Whitmire reached a settlement with our firefighters union to not only provide for a new contract that gave them a 10% raise immediately up to a 34% raise over the course of 5 years, but also to pay back pay, to pay them what they believe they should have been paid in those years of dispute. And that was $650 million. Now, that was money that we didn't have, laying in between our couch cushions. And so we had to go to Wall Street and borrow $650 million to pay them. And to be clear, what that meant, there's about 4,000 members of the our fire department. And with retirees, there's about 5,000. The average firefighter got a check for about $130,000, $140,000 in that settlement. We're going to be paying that off for 27 years. And so when my daughter's 34, we'll finally be done paying off the bill for that $650 million loan.
Adding into that, recently headlines have been all over about the police raise and paying police officers more money. Are we balancing in a situation to be able to bring this on as well?
Yeah, well, you have to look at both sides of the coin, right? We need police, we need firefighters, we need other municipal workers to come in and do these jobs, serve in these critical positions. We're not the only game in town, right? Or even the game in the state. And so if you have the city of Austin, the city of San Antonio, the city of Dallas paying more than we're paying, then that makes us not the best place for police and firefighters to come and work. And so we have to think about that competition. Similarly, with our municipal workers, if we're not paying enough, then they'll look to private sector for opportunities. Right. And so we have to think about that. And so giving our employees a raise is not on its own a bad thing. What you have to do is figure out a way to pay for it. Every cost you have to offset with some incoming revenue. And that's where we've been shouting from the rooftops is saying we have our cost structure going up, 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 and up. And we're not bringing in the money that can sustain that.
So how do you, if you're given the crystal ball, you're given the keys to the kingdom, what do you do to get us to, and I don't even know if a balanced budget is a real idea in today's world, but how do you balance off what we're spending to what we're taking in?
Yeah, well, that's where the job of the mayor comes in. The mayor's the chief executive of the city, and it's his job to manage that, right, to propose this budget by either increasing revenue or decreasing costs.
Is there a way to increase revenue without taxes, in your opinion?
There's not a way to increase revenue without it hitting the pocketbooks of Houstonians in some way, shape, or form, right? Okay. You might propose a garbage fee, for example, which is not a tax, but if you live in Houston and you get your trash picked up, you're going to be paying it. And so it's going to come out of your pocket. There's some other thoughts about how maybe to pull some money out of the water system, but that means your water bill is probably going to go up to cover that. And so there's some impact that's going to be coming on the revenue side that's probably going to touch your life if you live within the bounds of the city of Houston.
I want to remind everyone the number here, 713-440-8870. We're talking with City Controller Chris Hollins, and we have Melinda on the phone calling us from the Heights. Hello, Melinda.
Hello.
What's on your mind?
Hear me.
Yes, we can. What's on your mind?
Well, I do believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that when Whitmire came into office and he struck this deal with the firefighters, he gave them a defined benefit plan rather than a 401k. And I think that's too expensive. Everybody is moving away from those. And I did vote for Whitmire, but I think that was a mistake.
Melinda, thank you for that. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, so for those listeners that don't know what the defined benefit plan is, that's essentially a pension that says, hey, for the rest of your life, you're going to get X $1,000, and that's going to come in day in or day out. On the other side, a 401k, as she mentioned, or a defined contribution plan, that says, hey, we're going to put this much money in your investment account, and when you retire, that investment account is yours, and you figure out, those next steps. There is a healthy debate about if cities can afford defined benefit plans going out 30 years. And right now, the city has an unfunded liability for our pensions of upwards of $2 billion. And so we have to think about that for sure. But at the end of the day, that's a negotiation between the city and our labor unions. Mm-hmm. And, labor unions for now, of course, are fighting for that defined benefit plan. But it's up to the mayor to have those negotiations and to reach those agreements.
And another point on this is, this is one of the benefits that drive people to go to work for the city government. City government generally doesn't pay as well as the private sector, but this is one of those things that the city government can offer that will be an incentive to work for the government.
No, absolutely, and I can speak from this personally. I mean, my father was a police officer who served with HPD for 34 years. My mom and he are both retired right now, and they're living off of his pension. She had a 401k for work that I can tell you would not have gotten them very far. And so that sense of security that comes with that is critically important for folks. And as you mentioned, Doug, they make sacrifices and take lower pay throughout their entire careers to secure that pension. And so, again, it's not a right or wrong thing on providing financial security to our retirees. It's how are we going to pay for it? And it's being realistic, looking at the numbers hard, and telling the truth about the choices we have to make to move the city forward.
If you have questions, thoughts, concerns for Chris Hollins, our city controller, you can give us a call right now. It's 713-440-8870. Scott is on the line from Galleria. Hello, Scott. What's on your mind?
Yes, thanks for taking my call, and wonderful to talk with you, Chris. I'm wondering, we've got about 32 billion gallons of water that's being lost every year through our distribution system. And from what the Public Works Director says, about 6% of the infrastructure accounts for 2/3 of that loss. So what is the payback period that we're looking at in terms of an investment on just that 6% of infrastructure to be able to take care of 66% of that $32 billion loss if we were to take into account the revenue that we would receive and the amount of inspection costs that we would save and the maintenance cost on that? Have you done a study on that particular issue?
Scott, thank you for that. I'm looking at Chris as you're going through all the numbers, and I'm getting lost in there, but it looks like you followed it all the way through.
Absolutely. So it's not $32 billion, but we're leaking 32 billion gallons of water every single year, which could source the entire city of Fort Worth, Texas, just to be clear about the volume and magnitude of that. It's a big problem, and we do need to invest. I think right now there are upwards of 1,000 water leaks across the city water system. That's where the enterprise fund comes in, the combined utility system. You pay your water bill. Of course, when you turn your faucet, you want water to come out of that. But we also want to repair this system so that it works for the long term, and we want to secure water sources for the rest of our lives. Right now, the water that we have is projected to run out in the 2030s. And of course, that's sped up if we're leaking 30 billion gallons of water a year. We have an audit plan to look into that. I couldn't tell you right now the exact cost estimate of that. I believe, what Public Works has is probably the best information that we have for now. But when you're paying your water bill, you want to make sure that money is going towards fixing that system, not towards other things. And that's what we're looking at right now in this budget.
Straighten me out on something. Is the city doesn't pay for water, right? I mean, basically, when I pay my water bill, I'm paying for the infrastructure that brings the water to my house. So does the city actually lose money, or it loses water whenever there's a water leak?
Well, there's no free lunch, Doug, and so yeah. So the city's not paying for every gallon of water that comes in the door, but the city pays for water rights, right? And so, as water flows through rivers and tributaries and so forth, we've laid claim to a chunk of that, and we also have reservoirs, and that. Again, we live in a world where we're being more aware of our resources, climate change, and so on. Water. We need to be paying attention to make sure that we can source this community, not just today, but for years to come. And in West Texas, they're already having some real challenges with supply of water. And so leaking 32 billion gallons is something that you want to try and avoid.
On the national landscape, all they talk about these days seems to be DOGE and cutting waste and spend and abuse and all of that. Looking at our city budget, do you see areas where there's abuse and waste that could be rolled back and could help us with these projected shortfalls?
There are certainly opportunities for us to be more efficient. If your listeners are real people, right? When you deal with government, you probably see, they're not being as efficient as I'd like them to be. And it's part of my job as a city controller, which, the city audit function sits underneath me, to look for those opportunities. We've been, over the course of my tenure, building out our audit division. And our audit division is the most under-resourced, smallest of any major city in Texas, even though we're the largest city with the largest city government. And we've been asking the mayor and city council for additional resources really since day one. So far, that request has been unmet. But with the team that we have, we're working hard. We laid out an audit plan that includes 37 audits just about a month and a half ago. And we're going to be pushing hard to roll through those audits to look at things like overtime spending, to look at what we're spending on city fuel cards and our fleet management, and how much we're spending on contracts, and find ways that we can carve out, $1 million here and $5 million there. And that starts to add up really quickly.
Well, Chris, I'm going to let you get back to doing the math and checking on the money. City Controller Chris Hollins, thank you so much for joining us.
First ever in-studio guest, Chris
Yes,
Hollins.
you were the very first guest we had on the show. And
Great to
welcome
be
back.
with y'all.
You're always welcome to come back and talk with us. After.